how we doing? Feeling good? Wow, the energy is a little low today, guys. I'm just gonna be honest with you, all right? All right, how we doing? Oh, that's better. Okay, good. It's our grand opening next week, as Danae was saying, which is just kind of crazy. Again, I know she already said a lot of these things, but she's like, I'm sorry. It's okay, you can steal my thunder. It's one of those things for me, again, and I know I've said this almost every week, that as we get closer and closer to this, everything gets more and more real. Everything is like, holy cow, this is coming. But then I was thinking a little bit more, and it's already been. Like, I've been waiting for this grand opening, and there's a part of me, I was a little bit convicted this last week. I'm like, it's been happening. Ministry's been happening since January 6th, the day Danae and I decided, for sure we are starting this church. It's been happening. God has been moving. He's been showing up in so many spaces. I mean, I could spend, I'm not even kidding, 4 or 5 hours at least just telling story after story after story of how God has shown up time and time and time and time again. And again, the coolest part for me is, and I want you to know as my pastor's heart, like a pastor heart, I, of course, want this room so filled, but I made a commitment to God. Now, I've said this a few times, but if you're new, I want you to know this too. I made a commitment, and if it's 5 people, I'm going to be faithful with 5 people showing up. If it's 50 people, I'm going to be faithful with 50 people. If it's 500, 5,000, 500, maybe not that much, right? Okay, like that's dreaming big. But it didn't matter to me. I wanted to be faithful in and through this. But I also believe that this church is going to make some serious impact. I really believe that. And when you look around South Meridian and you see there are so many new homes going up all around this area, and there's not a lot of churches around this area. And some of the churches that we have around this, they're great churches, but if every church actually held what needs to happen in this valley, specifically in South Meridian, we'd have 10,000 people at every service because there's simply not enough churches for the people that need to be in churches, yes? And so our heart is for God to move, truly. But the way he moves is through his people. It's not me as a pastor. It's not Josh as a worship leader. It's not just our kids' ministry. It is you. You and me, all of us, we are the church. This is just a building. These are just 4 walls with really bad lighting, right? That's what this is. This is not the church. You are the church. And so this whole series that we've been in, this idea of only the strong, again, the context here is that we are not strong. That none of us on our own have the strength to do anything that really God is calling us to. It is through him that we have strength. And so we've looked at great stories. We've looked at stories of Moses. We've looked at the story of Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. We looked at Jonah last weekend, and even a guy that was just so defiant and stubborn when it came to God's will. God still used him, God's strength in Jonah. And this weekend we're talking about David. And David is like an easy one to be like, oh yeah, like David, he was super strong, except for David really wasn't. That dude was quite a mess. And if you have any sort of like church background, a lot of times David is touted as like this amazing hero, and he was a hero of faith, a man after God's own heart, a great dude. At the same time, he made a lot of mistakes. And when you think about like approaching the throne of grace with confidence, have you ever heard that terminology before? It's a very churchy terminology. But you approach the throne of grace with confidence. It's because we could look at stories like David where he goes, dang, this guy really was kind of a disaster, and yet he was able to approach the throne of grace with confidence. And that's this last piece. We were going to end the series last weekend, but we decided to carry on one more weekend because we wanted to talk about this and then kind of like do a standalone on our grand opening. But this idea of identity. Who and whose we are. It was so cool chatting with Matt and just getting to know him a little bit more. I know, am I embarrassing you, dude? Okay, good. You're like, I don't get embarrassed. You just called it an F it bucket. That was crazy and kind of awesome in the same way. I like that you called it a Jesus bucket. That's probably a little bit, more spiritual. That's good. But this idea, again, of identity, and when we were chatting, I remember just kind of thinking, we met at the village, and we were hanging out, and this idea, again, of understanding, okay, I'm 41 years old, and I don't know if it's because I hit 41. Is it 41 is that over the hill? Is 40 over the hill, or is 50 over the hill? Which one is it? Some of you that are like, I'm 60, I'm still not over the hill, okay, buddy? All right? Like, I don't know if it was that for me, but right around the age of 40, I kind of went like, God, what are you doing? Like, where am I at? Like, what's going on here? Anyone else ever had that moment where you're just like, who am I? What are you calling me to? Like, what's going on? And then I was thinking about it even more. It's not just at the age of 40. I could think that happened at the age of 20 for me. Like when I was graduating college, 2022, right around that age and that stage of life, I was going, God, what are you doing? And then if I thought about it a little bit more, I remember thinking when I was in middle school even, who am I? And then I was thinking that at the age of 30, when we kind of transitioned, I was like, who am I? And then I started realizing it actually has nothing to do with age. It has to do with stage. All these different seasons, all these different stages of life going, God, who am I? Who are you calling me to be? What's my identity? Have you ever been there before? Can we have, I love and hate doing this at the same time, but I think it's so powerful. Can I have those of us that are struggling right now with what God's kind of calling us to, the identity piece, boldly, would you raise your hand right now? Whoa, cool. Wait, can you do it again? Look around. Look around. We've talked about this quite a few times. If you're new with us at Storyline, I want you to know one of the ways the enemy still kills and destroys most effectively is through isolation, through making you feel like you're the only one going through what you're going through. Raise your hand if you're struggling with identity right now. Doesn't that feel good? Doesn't that feel like I'm getting goosebumps right now, just feeling like, okay, God, there's a reason you called for us to talk about this today. Because well over 3/4 of the room are struggling with, who am I? Whose am I? And so before we even get into the whole story of David or anything, I want to set this foundation that as a believer, my identity is not found in my circumstances. It's not found in my stages of life or seasons of life. It's found in who? Christ. And when we get that more and more, that foundation that we build upon will give us more and more kind of a glimpse into really how to walk out this life with effectiveness. And so there are verses like Galatians 2:20 that says, I have been crucified with Christ. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith, it says, in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. And so my identity is in him. And then you have other verses like 2 Corinthians 5:17. It says, therefore, if anyone, who? I like interaction, right? If anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone. The new is here. So my identity is in Christ, not in the sin I made or the season of life or any of that stuff that's going on. It is in Christ. And Matt, you nailed it, man. Thank you for sharing your story. That's exactly what we're talking about this week, is all the different areas that we tend to lend our identity, that we tend to kind of give or entrust our identity into all these other areas that have nothing to do with what God's actually wanting to do in our life. So today, I'm going to do something really corny. I was supposed to grab rubber bands, but I didn't. I totally forgot about it up until this moment, right? So I want you to hold your fingers out like this. I know, it's corny. You're like, why are we doing it? Josh is like, DJ, I told you shouldn't do this, all right? But I'm going to do it anyways. And I want you to imagine just like stretching a rubber band for a second. Can you imagine feeling the tension as you stretch a rubber band? Don't make it weird, Kent, all right? As you stretch a rubber band a little bit. And so that piece, that idea of tension, you're going to feel a tension today. You're going to feel this tension between being loved by God, being a child of God. If you call yourself a believer, if you've confessed with your mouth and you believed in your heart that Jesus is Lord, you're feeling one side of this tension. And then as you pull the rubber band, you're going to feel another piece of this tension. And this other piece is a God who disciplines, a God who loves, but also a God who wants to see good happen in our lives. But the only way that tends to happen is by showing us a little bit of how we need to grow. I don't want to use this word, but I can't think of another one. How we need to improve, how we need to stretch ourselves to new places. And that only happens with this tension, this piece of this isn't comfortable. Tension's never comfortable. And so today, again, looking at the example of David, because he is a phenomenal example of all the different tensions that we feel when it comes to identity. I want to kind of complete this sentence each time, that my identity can be found in the Lord even when. My identity can be found in the Lord even when. And my identity can be found in the Lord even when I'm forgotten. Have you ever felt forgotten? Ever felt like, God, you're doing all these other things and all these other people. Why aren't you doing anything in me? God, where are you? Ever felt that way before? In the story, we're going to be all over. I mean, the story of David, it's in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and even in 1 Kings. It's a huge story. There's such a huge focus on David. And so we're going to be bouncing around quite a bit. I always want you to bring a physical Bible. I've said that over and over again. If you don't like physical Bibles and you want the digital, that's great, no problem at all. If you don't have a Bible, there are Bibles out there on the table right in the foyer there, or I guess hallway, whatever you want to call it. All right, you could grab yourself a Bible. It's free. But as we kind of dive into this, just let me give a little bit of a recap to kind of the story. And again, I don't presume to assume that everyone here knows the story of David. I understand that there are a lot of us that are still searching out our faith, or maybe don't have faith at all. We're here just checking this out. So I want to catch everyone up on the same page. And if you've been a Christ follower for 20-something plus years, I promise you today there's going to be something that you're going to pull out. Or I'm going to even, not just promise, I'm going to challenge you. Find something today to pull out that's going to challenge your faith, because there will be stuff that will challenge it. But as we kind of get to this place, Israel is begging for a king. They have not had a king in a really, really long time, and that's what they've known. And so they've been begging God, hey, God, we want a king. We want a king. We want a king. Even Samuel, the prophet that we're going to talk about today, the book of Samuel, even Samuel wants a king. All these guys, they want a king, and God's like, no, you don't want a king. Believe me, a king just rules over you. You don't want a king. They're like, no, we want a king. And so what does God do? This is one of the cool pieces. Again, if you've been a Christ follower for 20 plus years, sometimes God gives you what you want. And that's not always a good thing. That's not always a good thing. Sometimes you look back, have you ever gotten what you want and you're like, dang it, why did I ask for that? Why did I do that? Why did I want that? And you got it, and then you're like, shoot, I don't want it anymore. I want to give it back. And I was like, you can't give it back anymore. That's what you got. That's what's going on with Israel right now. The people chose the king, and it's Saul. And Saul is not a good king, but they wanted Saul. So God's like, all right, you want Saul? I'll give you Saul. It even talks about God gives him his anointing, his blessing over Saul, which is kind of an interesting. God's like, all right, you want it? I'll still bless him, but he's not the one I chose for you. Actually, I didn't choose any of these guys for you. I didn't want you to have a king. All right? Eventually, Saul disobeys God completely. He does counter to what God's asking him to do. He was supposed to completely follow through with a task that God made very clear to him. He didn't do it. He lied to God. God removes the blessing from him. And then God says, hey, Samuel, the prophet that we're going to be in there, again, the book of Samuel, hey, Sam, you need to go and anoint another king, someone different than Saul, because this is not my guy. I did not choose him. The people chose him. But I gave the people what they wanted. And that's where we're going to pick up in this story. We're going to be in 1 Samuel 16, 10 through 11, I should say. Yeah, 10 through 11. All right? And again, at this point, Samuel arrives at the house of Jesse, and he's kind of going through figuring out who's going to be the next king. And God hasn't revealed to Samuel yet, so he's kind of looking at all these different people, trying to figure out, God, is this the anointed one? Is this the one you want me to bless as the king? Who is this? Who is this? Right? And so he goes on. Look at verse 10 then. It says, now Jesse had 7 sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all the sons that you have? So again, in the context here, all these 7 different sons of Jesse are passing through. And if you read just a little bit ahead of this, which I'd encourage you, read all of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, and 1 Kings. It is a really cool story. Like, I get sucked in. I'm like, man, they need to make a movie out of this because it's so good. All right? Read the whole thing. But right before all of this, like, Samuel's like, all right, he sees the first son, and he's like, holy cow, God, that's got to be the king, right? He's a stud. And then God's like, no, not that guy. And then the next brother, no, holy cow. Like, I could just remember, I love putting myself in the story. Like, Samuel was like, no, that guy's even better looking and bigger than the last guy. And then each guy goes through, again, 7 the sons of Jesse go through. And then like Samuel's like, so is there anyone else? Is there anyone else? And then, Samuel was like, yeah, well, they're still the youngest. They're still David, but you don't want David. He's just the puny guy. It says that they sit and wait for David to show up. Have you ever felt forgotten? Have you ever felt disqualified? God doesn't really want to use me, maybe you've thought before. Surely David has felt this way, but his identity was not in that circumstance. His identity was in the Lord. See, it's easy to put our identity in how others see our value. It's super easy to kind of put like, oh, you see me this way? I guess that's who I am. I guess that's kind of who I am. And if you're valuable, then you're seen. And this happens not just like in you, this happens like in your family systems. I can't help but think like every dynamic of having a kid, right? So I have 3 kids, so I kind of get all of them. I get the oldest, the middleest, and the youngest, right? I get all of them, so I understand. So I look at my middle child, who's Bryn, and I often think, I like the middle kid syndrome. I cannot leave Bryn out. So I'm trying to be super intentional with Bryn all the time. But then there's this other piece of me that's like, well, yeah, but Beckett's the youngest, so you need to make sure you spend time with Beckett too, so he understands that you love him too. So I'm like, oh yeah, I got to spend time with Beckett. But then there's my oldest, Brooklyn, and she's the one that always has to go through the stuff first, right? She's the firstborn. She's the one that's like has to get the gauntlet first. So often I feel so bad for Brooklyn because I'm like, I'm sorry, honey, we've never had anyone try to date you before, so we're going to be a lot more strict with you than I probably will be with anyone else, all right? I remember when we gave all the kids iPhones during COVID because the reason why we wanted to allow them to go online and do their online schooling instead of take our bandwidth, and she's like, they got iPhones at the age of 7, and I'm at like 11 years old or 12, I forget how old she was at that point, and she was so mad, and I'm like, I don't want her to feel left out. And there's this piece as a father, I'm like, the middleest, the oldest, the youngest, like how do I care for all these people and their identity? So it happens in family systems. It happens in playground football. Have you ever been the last one chosen? Have you been scared that you're going to be the last one chosen? Maybe you're that way. Matt's like, I've never been the last one chosen. Not in football, at least. Like identity, it's easy to entrust your identity into how other people see your value. Friendship circles. If they invite you to that party or not, then you're like, yeah, I have value. They invited me to the party. I've always wanted to go to that New Year's party. Or if they don't, and you're like, forget you then. Like, I didn't want to hang out with, like, your value is often attached to how other people see your value. Why do we do that? Why do we do that? Because there's a major problem when we do things like that. See, people often can't see our value beyond their use of us. Read that again. People often can't see my value beyond their use of me, what they can get out of me. And our society is dangerous this way. The only reason I'm going to be friends with you is because you work at a dealership, and someday when I want to buy a car, I want to make sure I have a hookup. Have you been there before? I mean, I'm not immune to that. There's been times I've held friendships because I'm like, I remember this is, I'm just kind of falling on the sword here. I remember there was specifically a friendship in San Diego I held on to because they were a realtor, and I knew someday I would need a realtor. And so I stayed close to them because if I needed to sell my house, maybe they would give me a discount. That is jacked up. But you're like, I've done that too. I've done that too. Because it's a little bit of our human nature to use other people. And I don't think we do it maliciously, by the way. I'm not saying that that's our heart to be like, at other people. But we often only see other people's values as far as we could use their value. And that's dangerous on both sides when we give them the value and also when we're getting that value from them. I was checking out this video on Facebook, and I kind of came across it, and I thought, this illustrates this so well. And so I know it might be a little hard to see here, but there's this little girl. She's playing soccer, right? And if you look at her value right here, you're like, yeah, she's not very valuable. Look at how she's kicking. And you're like, yeah, she has no business being a soccer player. And then you're like, yeah, it's because she's not a soccer player. She's a gymnast. I mean, I love that illustration of like, sometimes we look at other people and we're like, yeah, you're not very valuable until they offer something different. And you're like, holy cow, who are you? If we were to only judge people on the value we see or we give to them, man, we would miss out on all the value they actually have to offer. And I'm talking on both sides of these things. I'm talking about us when we see that, and I'm talking about how other people see us. Our identity is not in other people. It's not in being forgotten. It's in the Lord. And my identity is in the Lord when I'm forgotten, and it's in the Lord when I'm triumphant. Because we've been there too. We've been in those places that are like, oh, who am I? Like, I'm not dead. And then we've also been in those places that the total different side, that mountaintop, like, yeah, like this is good. You should see how awesome I am right now. Do you see how many awards I've gotten? Again, Matt, I love, your story was so pointed. It was like so on point, like that piece of like, yeah, my car, do you see what kind of car I drive right now? Do you see the awards that are on my wall? Do you see what I'm going through? Do you see the size of my house? Do you see how big my trailer is? What kind of vacations I'm taking? How often I travel? Like, it's really easy to also put our identity in those triumphant moments. And in David's story here, he goes from forgotten, literally forgotten, to the hero. Like, the man. And so, turn with me to 1 Samuel 17. Literally, you just have to flip a page. At least I do. And so at this point, now David, he's been kind of, for lack of a better word, seen and anointed by Samuel. And then the Lord starts to remove the blessing from Saul. And when he does this, it says, just in that one chapter, that Saul begins to be tormented by evil spirits. And he wants to get relief from them. And so because of that, he calls on one of his servants, and his servants is like, hey, there's this guy, son of Jesse, who plays the lyre. You should have him come and play and see if it doesn't relieve some of those that feeling of like that overwhelmness and anxiety, the evil spirits that are tormenting you, Saul. And so Saul's like, that's a great idea. Send this kid in. And so David enters into Saul's life at this point and then kind of stays in it. He becomes like a helper, a servant to Saul. And then further, you kind of move along. At this point, the whole kingdom of Israel goes into war with the Philistines. And they've been in war. There have been lots of tension at this point. But they're like in the heat of battle. And this is where David and Goliath comes in, right? Because you have Goliath, this warrior, and someone needs to face him. And so David, he's literally bringing sandwiches to his brothers. Like that was his role. Again, still a little bit forgotten. He's just playing music, I guess, for anyone. Do you ever feel like David, Josh? Like, you're like just playing the guitar up. Anyways. But like all he's doing is playing music. He's delivering sandwiches still. And there's Goliath in the field. And someone's like, hey, someone needs to face this guy. And David's like, I'll do it. I'll do it. Which is just kind of a cool thing. But when you look a little bit at the context, David's been a shepherd. He knows exactly how to fight big things. Says that he's been fighting bears, he's been fighting tiger. Like, he knows how to defend. He knows how to fight. And he's gotten some confidence. And so, look at the verse. It says, as the Philistine moved closer to attack him again, that's Goliath, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. And the stone sank deep into his forehead. And he fell face down on the ground. So David, here's the word, triumphed over the Philistines with a sling and one stone without a sword in his hand, and he struck down the Philistine and killed him. Yes, I am the man. My identity is in my success. Did you see what I just did? Did you see who I just killed? His head is right here in my hand. The sword that I used to slay it off at that point. Like, it's easy to put our identity in our successes. But do I only find my identity in my success? Is that the sole place I put my identity? I want to challenge you in this because this is often, as a society, where we often do. It's not just the people piece. It's if I am successful, then I am valuable. This is a huge piece of our community. If I am successful, then I am seen. If I am successful, then I am loved. If I am successful, then I am popular. If I am successful, fill in the blank. That's what we do in our society. It's what we do in our culture, and it's so dangerous because that's not our identity. So let's talk about it for a second. What is success? What is success? Is it how much money we make? Is that success? Is it how many friends I have? It's how many likes I have on Facebook or how many shares of whatever thing I posted. Is that my success? Is it how many underlings I have in my business? How many employees I have? Is it how, ooh, this is ready. You ready? Tune in right here. If you've tuned out, tune in. Is it how busy you are? Is that your success? Is how busy you are? You ever get that from other people? Have you been that way? I know I've been that way before. Hey, how are things going? Oh my gosh. If only you knew how busy I am right now because I'm so popular. Anyone else, you've been there before? I may not say it like that, but that's kind of what I meant in the past is like, if you only knew my schedule, you would know that I am like the man. I'm so busy all the time. We put our success in our busyness, and it's actually like the opposite. And to me, when people do that to me now, because I think I'm wiser and older now that I'm over the hill at 41 years old, right? When I do that now, I kind of can't help but like chuckle in my brain, like who are you trying to like puff your chest up to, man? Woman? Like you don't need to do that to me. I don't view that as a badge of honor. Success or busyness is not a badge of honor. It's what my wife and I say all the time. Busyness is not a badge of honor. I feel bad for people when they say, I'm so busy. I'm so busy. I'm like, ooh, sorry. So sorry. It's not our success. Here's what James, jumping around just a little bit, James 1 says, believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position. But the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wildflower. And that's not picking on rich people. He's making a point that he's made over and over and over again. The whole theme of the Bible is all about humility, pride before the fall. Like, look, you want to be rich? Don't worry about tomorrow. Do you see how the flowers are dressed? The splendor of all of, what king is it? Is it Saul? Solomon, yeah, thank you. The king, Solomon, all of his splendor wasn't dressed like any of these flowers, yet God takes care of these flowers. Like, are you kidding me? Our success is not in our triumph. See, the standard of success in the kingdom of God is not the same as in this world. And the quicker we grasp that as a people, I use this word, easier life will be. I don't know if that's the best word, but the more context we will have in and through the hard times, the hard stuff that we deal with, we'll start to get a little bit more that our success is not in our triumph. And so it's not in our triumph, and it's not when we're forgotten. So our identity then is in the Lord's, even when I'm sinful. Even when I'm sinful. So David, he joins Saul's army at this point. He slays Goliath. Everyone knows David's name. He becomes somewhat of like a general in Saul's army. And God's blessing is all over David. So much so that at this point, inside Saul's heart, he's getting bitter and angry and jealous over David because of all these different things, all these different successes that he has. And so Saul is so threatened by David. What does he do? He starts to plot ways to kill David. And so David starts to flee for his life. And there's two instances, I think it's so loud. There's two instances where David could have killed Saul, but he chose, nope, God told me don't lay a hand on Saul. So he could have done it, but he doesn't do it. Eventually, Saul ends up killing himself, and David becomes king. He becomes the man. But like I said, sometimes when you become the man, maybe you didn't really want to become the man, right? Maybe you didn't really want to experience that. And so let's turn to 2 Samuel. We're going to be at 11, 2 through 4. And so again, all these different things happen. So David, he is the king at this point. And no doubt, and all the things that he's going through, like that piece of like, I am the man is there, right? He has all sorts of confidence. You already know that because of Goliath. He's already had all these successes. But now something different starting to happen in him. Look at verse 2. So one evening, David got up from his bed and walked around the roof of the palace. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful. And David sent someone to find out about her. And the man said, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Then David sent messengers to get her, which is crazy. And she came to him, and he slept with her. And she was purifying herself from the monthly unclean. Then she went back home. And I'm looking at verse 5 too. Look, it says, the woman conceived and sent word to David saying, what does it say? I am pregnant. I am pregnant. So here's this guy who's had God's blessing all over him. He's had triumph at this point, like God's blessing all over him. And he makes this horrible mistake. What does he do? He sleeps with Bathsheba. But what's crazy about this, that would be one thing. Honestly, like even as like a pastoral heart, that would be one thing. Like I understand people go through hard times. I get it. We all do. But David does two more ridiculously horrible things, almost back to back, right after deciding to sleep with Bathsheba. What does he do? He says, okay, crud, she's pregnant. What should we do? Oh, I have an idea. Go get Uriah. Go get her husband from the front lines. Bring him home and be like, hey, you get to celebrate with your wife at your home. Sleep with her. Maybe she'll conceive, or she's already conceived, but he'll think that it's his baby. Yeah, do that. And so what do? That's what they do. They call Uriah back home, and Uriah, being the stud that he is, he's like, why am I home? All my men are still fighting. I don't want to be home. And so he makes this decision, I'm not going to sleep with my wife. None of my guys get to come home and sleep with their wives. So I'm not going to sleep. I'm just going to stay and sleep outside the door. So I'm not even tempted to sleep with my wife. So David's plan's like, oh, okay, no, oh God, what should I do? I'm going to send him into the front lines, and then he'll be killed. And then I won't have to worry about this anymore. So that's what he does. He sends Uriah to the front line of the battlefield, surely to his death. He knew exactly what he was doing. Remember, he's a general. He's a leader. He knew exactly what was going on. So Uriah, he dies. And so it wasn't just one sinful thing. It was three sinful things. Sleeping with Bathsheba, trying to be manipulative with Uriah, and then killing Uriah. What's crazy about this is actually one of David's friends. Like, we know from Scripture that Uriah, the Hittite, was one of David's 30-something mighty men. The dude slept with probably one of his good friend's wives, brought one of his good friends home to manipulate him, and then sent one of his good friends to die. I don't know what you're dealing with in your sin life right now, because we all have it. But can you take a deep breath right now and be like, woo, all right, I feel good all of a sudden. Like, I'm light on my feet right now. Like this was still a man after God's own heart. That's the craziest part of all of this. My identity is in the Lord, even when I am sinful. And we know that. Again, Acts 13:22, after removing Saul, he made David their king, and God testified concerning him. I have found David, son of Jesse, a man after my own heart. That's cool stuff right there. Again, if you've been a Christ follower for 20 plus years, that's got to be something that is like such a cool reminder of like, God, you are good. Despite all the things I've been through, God, you are still good. And if you're a new believer here, I want you to know that, yes, he is good. He's so good. And so you can find your identity in him when you're forgotten, when you're sinful, when you're triumphant, and you could find your identity in him. And this is going to be something, it's going to be a hard topic right here. Okay, you ready? Again, I say this a lot, but tune out, tune in. Even when I'm disciplined, this is not the fun part we like talking about in church. It's just not. We don't like being talked about discipline in the church. We like talking about God's love. Our culture just wants to hear about a God who accepts and is open to all these different things. The problem with that is that's not scriptural. And I'm sorry, but if we're going to read this word, we're going to read all of it. And we're going to take it at its word because it's the infallible, unfailing truth of God right here. And some of these things that we're going to talk about here in just a minute are going to jack with you just a little bit. So I want you to be prepared. But it says, turn to 2 Samuel with me. So David commits these horrible things, does all three of those. And then there's this guy named Nathan, another prophet of God, is sent to David. All right? And has some words for David. He tells David a little bit of a story of some guy who basically cheated other people, and David's response was, that guy needs to die. That guy needs to die. Like, what are you kidding me? That guy needs to die. And Nathan says to David, you are that man. You are that guy. Read, again, we don't have time to do it, but read the first part of chapter 12. He's like, you're that guy. I wonder what David was thinking when he said that. Like, oh, crap. I am that guy. And so this is what Nathan has to say. It's really God speaking through Nathan. Now, therefore, the sword will never depart from your house, because you have despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. And this is what the Lord says. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity on you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to the one who is close to you. And he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret. To Saul's wives, by the way. But I will do this thing in broad daylight before all of Israel. And then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan replied, this is cool, but hard. Ready? The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. But because by doing this you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die. I told you this is going to jack with you a little bit. Because my sinful choices have consequences. Again, I get it. We love to think of God as a super loving, yes, of course he is. But he also has consequences for our sin. There were 3 consequences. Murder, all right? Because he killed Uriah, the sword would never depart from your home. So murder was a constant threat in David's household from now on. All of David's sons essentially tried to kill David at some point, basically, and try to take over his throne. So that's a big piece. Then this next consequence, his wives were given to another in public view. That actually happens in chapter 16, 2 Samuel. You can kind of go read that. All right, so another consequence. The third consequence, his firstborn son would die. And I don't know about you, but how can I follow a loving God who would kill a child because of my sin? Ooh, got really, that ended right at the exact time I said that. Whew. I mean, this is a real question. I mean, this is the same question I think a lot of us struggle with. How could a loving God, do horrible things to people that are good? Have you ever asked yourself that question before? And it's one of those questions you really have to wrestle with at some point in your walk with God, of understanding that God is never going to be comfortable with sin. He is never going to be comfortable with your and my sin. Remember how I said there's going to be a rubber band today? Are you feeling the tension that I talked about? Are you feeling now the tension of a loving God, but God who disciplines? Look, sin is a poison. Do you know how you become immune to poison? You drink it slowly in small amounts each day. That's how you become immune to poison. And that's how culture gets us. That's how slowly, tick, 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 we become more and more comfortable with the sin that's going on in our lives because tick, 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 sip, 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 the poison gets into our lives and we become immune to the consequences. We become immune to the sin choices. We become immune to all the things that are going on around us. And again, remember how I said, I think it was last week if you were with us, I talked about, or 2 weeks ago, I talked about this whole concept that we'll do evil in our own eyes. This is how it happens. We just drink little poison here and there, and it eats away at us. God has never intended us to be comfortable with sin. So I asked this question: what discipline would I have to undergo for God to get my attention? What discipline, what would he have to do? And I think this was part of what David was going through. And one of the reasons why, it's not listed throughout here very often where God does something as dramatic as actually taking a child's life because of David's sin consequences. That doesn't happen very often. But I really do believe it's part of why God allowed that to happen and then caused that to happen is because it was probably one of the only ways he could get David's attention. Hey, this is not okay. Stop doing this. And for us, this is a valid question. What discipline do we need to undergo for us to actually take God seriously? Because God's discipline and his mercy work together. They are decisively cooperative. If law without mercy, we would die. If mercy without law, then why the heck would we need God? We wouldn't even need to be obedient. We would just get mercy all the time. That's the problem with always believing that you have this loving God who will forgive you always. And yes, he does forgive you, but not without consequence. I know we don't like that. And again, I'm not trying to be like Jonathan Edwards, like fire and brimstone here or anything like that. But what I want us to understand is there's always going to be this tension. But God's love is always, and his plans are always bigger than ours. And while at Storyline, I'm always going to address questions like this. I might not always have the answer, by the way. There's going to probably be several times I'm going to go, hey, by the way, I don't know the answer to this, but I wanted to pose it anyways just so that you could do your homework too. There's going to be times I say that. But as I look a little bit more, I think I could understand how God would allow this to happen. I think the reason why is because when you look at David's life in the future, you see that all of his kids go haywire. All of them. Totally different thought. And I don't know the truth to this or not, but in my head, maybe God took this child for his mercy, the child's mercy. Because if the child would have lived out his life, there's a good chance it would have been a horrendous battlefield. Remember, the sword would never depart from your family. It would have been a bad, horrible, violent life. Maybe this was God's mercy. Of course, we can only see that years later. You can't see things like that in the moment. So I want us to look at this last scripture. Look at Hebrews. And you don't have to turn there. I'll just read it out loud. It says, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what child is not disciplined by their father? If you are not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not, here's the word, legitimate. Not true sons, not true daughters at all. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who've disciplined us, and we've respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in his holiness. And no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained for it, or trained by it. So can I encourage you in this? I am loved and disciplined as a child of God. And so right now, if you're undergoing some discipline, kind of go like, okay, that means I'm loved. If it feels like maybe there's some sin things going on in your life, you're wondering why your marriage is not working, I'm guessing that there's probably some sin things going on there, and God's probably disciplining you. And I know there's a lot more dynamic to that, and we could spend a lot more to it than that. I don't want to say that so flippantly. But look, Pride's a real thing. Pride's one of those things that sneaks in, kills, steals, and destroys. Pride's the number one reason we have wars, famine, divide. Like, it's nasty. So do I trust that God's discipline and his mercy are ultimately for my good? I'm going to have Josh come up. We're going to have a time of communion. And I thought this was such an appropriate opportunity for us to have communion together for the first time in this setting, which is really cool. But communion is an opportunity for us to remember, not just remember, but celebrate the death, his sacrifice, and his resurrection. And so we're going to hand out communion elements, and Josh is going to lead us in taking of the elements, but I want this to be a contemplative time. We don't do communion every week, because when we do communion, I really want it to be purposeful and intentional. And so in this next kind of few minutes here, let's be really intentional